The wilderness does not need to be malevolent to kill. It does not require mysterious forces or unexplained phenomena. It simply needs to be itself, a system of interlocking variables that can shift without warning, transforming a routine outing into a survival situation within minutes. Most wilderness fatalities do not result from a single catastrophic event. They result from cascades, a sequence of factors, each manageable in isolation, that combine into something unsurvivable. A weather change that would merely inconvenience a prepared hiker becomes deadly when paired with difficult terrain. A minor navigation error that would cost an hour on a clear day becomes fatal when fog rolls in. A river crossing that would be straightforward in late summer becomes lethal during spring snowmelt. Experienced outdoors people understand this. They know that the mountains, the deserts, the rivers operate by rules that do not accommodate human schedules or intentions. They know that preparation reduces risk, but never eliminates it. They know that the line between a successful trip and a body recovery can be measured in small decisions made under pressure. This video examines cases where nature's variables aligned against people who were doing almost everything right. People who made one or two ordinary mistakes, the kind that hikers make every day without consequence, and encountered conditions that transformed those mistakes into disasters. These are not stories of recklessness or incompetence. They are stories of how the wilderness punishes small errors with disproportionate severity. The pattern is consistent across terrain types and victim profiles. A cascade begins with something minor, a late start, an optimistic weather assessment, a decision to push slightly beyond planned limits. Then conditions shift, and suddenly the margin for error, which seemed adequate moments before, no longer exists. If you find value in examination of how wilderness incidents develop, subscribe to this channel. We analyze the factors that contribute to disappearances and fatalities. We document the decision points where outcomes might have changed. We present evidence that can inform safer choices for those who venture into wild places. Our first case involves a woman whose experience should have protected her. A hiker who had completed hundreds of miles on one of America's most famous trails, who understood backcountry navigation, who carried appropriate equipment. Her disappearance would become one of the most extensively documented cases in Appalachian trail history, not because of what happened to her, but because of what she left behind. Geraldine Largay was 66 years old when she set out to hike the Appalachian Trail in April of 2013. She was a retired nurse from Brentwood, Tennessee, who had developed a passion for long-distance hiking after her career ended. She had completed sections of the AT in previous years, and this trip was intended to finish what she had started, a northbound through hike from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, to Mount Katahdin in Maine. She was not hiking entirely alone. Her husband George served as her support crew, meeting her at road crossings to resupply food, provide encouragement, and offer the comfort of familiar company during rest days. This arrangement allowed her to experience the solitude of trail life while maintaining connection to her marriage and a safety net of regular contact. Her trail name was Inchworm, a reference to her slow but steady hiking pace. She did not cover impressive daily mileages. She stopped frequently to enjoy views, take photographs, and rest. What she lacked in speed, she made up for in persistence. Mile by mile, she was making her way toward Katahdin. By July of 2013, she had reached western Maine. The terrain there is among the most challenging on the entire Appalachian Trail. The path crosses remote wilderness areas with few road access points. The forest is dense, composed of spruce and fir, that limit visibility to a few dozen feet in many areas. The trail itself is often faint, marked by white blazes painted on trees that can be difficult to spot when attention lapses. On July 21st, she stayed at the Poplar Ridge Lean-To, a shelter approximately 22 miles from the town of Rangeley. She shared the shelter with other hikers that night, as was common on the trail. The next morning, July 22nd, she departed alone, planning to hike approximately 11 miles to the next shelter at Spalding Mountain. She never arrived. What happened that morning has been reconstructed from evidence found much later. At some point during the first few miles of hiking, she left the trail to relieve herself, a routine necessity that every long-distance hiker performs multiple times daily. When she finished and tried to return to the trail, she could not find it. The forest in that section of Maine is disorienting even for experienced navigators. The trees are dense and similar in appearance. The undergrowth is thick with ferns and blowdowns. The terrain is hilly, but not dramatically so, offering few landmarks that would help establish direction. A person who walks 50 feet off the trail can find themselves in a landscape that looks identical in all directions. She had a compass, but limited skill in using it. She had a cell phone, but no signal in the remote wilderness. She had a spot satellite messenger that could send preset messages and emergency signals, but her attempts to use it failed, possibly due to the dense tree canopy blocking satellite reception, possibly due to user error in an increasingly panicked state. Her text message attempts were recorded on her phone, recovered much later. At approximately 11 in the morning on July 22nd, she tried to send a message to her husband. In prior call, prior. The garbled text suggested she was struggling with the device, perhaps trying to activate voice-to-text in an area with no service. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, she sent another attempted text. Lost since yesterday. Off prior trail 3 or prior so prior. Call prior, me prior. The message did not transmit. She was approximately 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. In dense Maine forest, with no navigation skills to speak of, those 2 miles might as well have been 200. When she failed to meet her husband at the scheduled resupply point, he reported her missing on July 24th. The search that followed was extensive, involving hundreds of volunteers, search dogs, helicopters, and professional rescue teams. They covered thousands of acres of wilderness around the area where she had last been seen. They did not find her. The search continued at high intensity for weeks, then transitioned to periodic efforts as leads emerged. Reported sightings placed her in locations across New England. None were confirmed. The trail community mobilized, with hikers keeping alert for any sign of the missing woman. Nothing emerged. More than 2 years later, in October of 2015, a forestry surveyor working in a remote area approximately 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail discovered human remains and a campsite. The site contained a sleeping bag, a backpack, personal effects, and a journal. The remains were identified as Geraldine Largay. She had survived for at least 26 days after becoming lost. Her journal documented her experience in detail. She had established a camp and stayed in place, following the conventional wisdom that lost hikers should remain stationary rather than wandering further into the wilderness. She had rationed her food. She had collected water from a nearby stream. She had waited for rescue that never came. Her final entry was dated August 18th, 27 days after she left the trail. The entry was addressed to her husband, George. When you find my body, please call Prior, my prior husband, George. Prior. The text degradation suggested failing cognitive function, likely due to starvation and dehydration. She had died within 2 miles of the trail she had been hiking, in an area that searchers had covered during the initial effort. The dense vegetation had concealed her small camp from ground teams and made aerial observation impossible. The investigation examined the cascade of factors that had transformed a routine bathroom break into a fatal outcome. The first factor was the terrain. The Maine woods in that area are uniquely disorienting. Unlike western forests with their distinct tree species and open understory, the northern Appalachian forest presents a uniform wall of vegetation. Without landmarks or clear sight lines, navigation becomes extremely difficult. The second factor was her navigation skills. Despite her extensive hiking experience, she relied primarily on the well-marked Appalachian Trail and her husband's support for navigation. When removed from the trail and unable to contact her husband, She lacked the skills to determine direction and return to the path. The third factor was equipment limitations. Her spot messenger, a device designed for exactly this type of emergency, failed to transmit her distress signals. Whether this was due to canopy interference, device malfunction, or user error has never been definitively determined. The technology that might have saved her did not function when she needed it. The fourth factor was the search area. 2 miles may seem like a short distance, but in dense forest it represents an enormous volume of space that must be visually inspected. Searchers passed within proximity of her camp, but did not see it through the vegetation. The probability of visually locating a stationary person in such terrain, even with extensive search efforts, is lower than most people assume. The fifth factor was her decision to stay in place. The advice to remain stationary when lost is generally sound, as it prevents the person from moving further from their last known location. But it assumes that searchers will eventually reach the stationary position. In her case, the combination of dense vegetation and the size of the search area meant that remaining in place was not enough to ensure discovery. The investigation developed several perspectives on what might have changed the outcome. The first perspective focused on navigation skills. If she had carried a compass and known how to use it, she might have been able to determine the general direction of the trail and walk back to it. Basic compass skills are not difficult to learn, but they require practice before they can be applied under stress. The second perspective focused on her satellite messenger. The device had been tested before the trip and appeared functional, but satellite communication requires clear sky view, which the dense canopy may have blocked. A device with different technology, or more aggressive attempts to find a clearing with better sky exposure, might have allowed her signal to transmit. The third perspective focused on search methodology. Traditional ground searches in dense forest have significant limitations. More recent techniques involving thermal imaging, aerial drones, and systematic grid searches with tighter spacing might have located her camp sooner. Whether these techniques were available and applied in 2013 varied by jurisdiction and budget. The fourth perspective accepted that some situations simply exceed the margin for recovery. A person 2 miles off trail in dense wilderness, without navigation skills, with failed communication technology, may be functionally unrecoverable regardless of search effort. The forest is vast. Human beings are small. The mathematics of search probability in such terrain are unforgiving. Geraldine Largay made one clear error, leaving the trail without ensuring she could find her way back. It was the kind of error that hikers make daily without consequence. The forest does not usually swallow people who step off the path for a few minutes, but the combination of disorienting terrain, limited navigation skills, failed technology, and the sheer difficulty of finding one person in thousands of acres of dense vegetation transformed that small error into a fatal outcome. She survived for nearly a month, waiting for rescue, maintaining hope, documenting her experience in her journal. Help never reached her. Her case has influenced backcountry safety recommendations. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy now emphasizes navigation skills for all thru hikers. Satellite messenger manufacturers have improved their devices' ability to transmit through vegetation. Search and rescue organizations have studied her case to understand how extensive efforts can still fail to locate a stationary subject. The trail where she disappeared continues to carry thousands of hikers each year. Most pass through that section without incident, staying on the well-marked path, never needing to test their navigation skills in the surrounding forest. A small memorial marks the area near where she was found. The trees have continued to grow. The forest remains as dense and disorienting as it was on the day she stepped off the trail and could not find her way back. 1,200 miles to the west, in a landscape that shares nothing with the Maine woods except the capacity to kill the unprepared, another cascade was developing. This one would involve water rather than forest, swift current rather than dense vegetation, and a timeline measured in minutes rather than weeks. The Kings River drains the western slope of the Sierra Nevada in California, carrying snowmelt from peaks exceeding 14,000 feet, down through deep canyons to the Central Valley below. In late spring and early summer, When the mountain snowpack is melting rapidly, the river transforms from a manageable waterway into a powerful force that has killed experienced outdoors people and swept away vehicles that attempted crossings at the wrong time. On June 11, 2017, a 34-year-old emergency room physician named David Kowalski entered Kings Canyon National Park for a solo backpacking trip. He was an experienced hiker who had completed numerous trips in the Sierra Nevada over the previous decade. He understood mountain weather, altitude acclimatization, and the physical demands of backcountry travel. He was in excellent physical condition, maintaining a fitness regimen that allowed him to handle long days with heavy packs. His planned route was a loop through the Ray Lakes Basin, one of the most popular backcountry destinations in the park. The route typically takes 4 to 5 days, crossing several passes and traversing terrain that ranges from forested valleys to alpine meadows above treeline. It is considered moderately challenging, but well within the capabilities of experienced Sierra hikers. He obtained his wilderness permit at the Road's End Ranger Station on the morning of June 11th. Rangers noted that conditions in the high country were still affected by the heavy snowpack from the previous winter. The 2016 and 2017 winters had deposited record snowfall in the Sierra Nevada, and streams that would normally be easily crossed in June were running at levels more typical of early May. The ranger who issued his permit specifically warned him about high water conditions on creek crossings. She noted that several hikers had reported difficulty at the crossing of Woods Creek, where the normal route required fording a stream that was currently thigh-deep and fast-moving. She suggested he carry trekking poles for stability and consider turning back if crossings appeared dangerous. He acknowledged the warnings and departed on the trail at approximately 9 in the morning. The weather was clear and warm, with temperatures expected to reach the mid-70s in the valleys and the 50s at higher elevations. No precipitation was forecast for the duration of his trip. He made good progress on the first day, covering approximately 8 miles and camping near the confluence of Bubbs Creek and the South Fork of the Kings River. The following day, June 12th, he continued up the drainage toward the Ray Lakes Basin, climbing gradually through increasingly spectacular scenery. He reached the Woods Creek crossing in the early afternoon of June 12th. This crossing is a well-known challenge point on the Ray Lakes Loop. In normal conditions, it involves wading across a stream that is typically knee-deep with moderate current. In high water years, it becomes significantly more dangerous. What he encountered was a creek running approximately thigh-deep with a swift current estimated at 4 to 5 miles per hour. The water was glacial melt, with temperatures in the low 40s. The stream bed was composed of smooth granite cobbles that become extremely slippery when submerged. The standard technique for crossing such streams involves unbuckling pack straps so the pack can be jettisoned if the hiker falls, using trekking poles for stability, facing upstream and moving sideways across the current, and selecting a crossing point where the water is widest and therefore shallowest. He had trekking poles. He knew the technique. He had crossed similar streams before, though perhaps not at this water level. He was last seen by another hiking party at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, standing on the bank of Woods Creek and studying the crossing. The other hikers, a couple from San Diego, spoke with him briefly. He mentioned that the water looked challenging but manageable. They warned him to be careful. He said he would be fine. The San Diego couple continued downstream, having already completed their crossing earlier in the day, when conditions were slightly lower. They did not see him enter the water. When he failed to appear at his expected exit point 4 days later, rangers initiated a search. Teams hiked the route from both directions, checking campsites and looking for any sign of his passage. They found his pack on June 17th, wedged in a logjam approximately 300 yards downstream from the Woods Creek crossing. The pack was torn, with one shoulder strap missing entirely. The contents were mostly intact, but soaked. His sleeping bag, food, stove, and clothing were recovered. His camera, which had been clipped to a chest strap, was missing. His body was found on June 19th, nearly a mile downstream from the crossing, in a deep pool where the current had deposited debris from upstream. He was wearing his hiking boots and the base layers he would have had on when entering the water. He was not wearing his pack, confirming that he had followed the safety practice of unbuckling before the crossing. The medical examiner determined that death was caused by drowning, with hypothermia as a contributing factor. Bruising patterns suggested he had struck submerged rocks during the transit downstream. Whether he lost consciousness before drowning or remained aware throughout could not be determined. The investigation reconstructed the likely sequence of events. He had entered the water at the standard crossing point, a location that in normal conditions offers the best combination of depth and current. In the high water of June 2017, this point was significantly more dangerous than its appearance suggested. He likely lost his footing within the first few steps. The smooth granite cobbles provide almost no traction when covered by swift water. Once a hiker's feet slip, regaining balance against a strong current is extremely difficult, especially when the water is deep enough to create substantial lateral force against the body. When he fell, the current carried him downstream immediately. The cold water would have begun affecting his muscular coordination within seconds. His pack, though unbuckled, may have initially stayed with him before being torn away by the force of the water. He traveled approximately 300 yards in the initial transit, during which time he struck multiple rocks and was pulled through at least one section of rapids. By the time he reached the pool where his body was eventually found, he had likely lost the ability to swim or self-rescue. The water temperature was approximately 43 degrees. In water that cold, even a strong swimmer loses effective muscle function within 10 to 15 minutes. He was in the water for considerably less time than that, but the combination of cold shock, physical trauma from rock impacts, and the continuous force of the current made self-rescue effectively impossible once he lost his footing. The investigation examined the factors that had combined to produce the fatal outcome. The first factor was the unusually high water. The 2016 and 2017 snow years had been exceptional, depositing snowpack that was still melting rapidly in mid-June. Stream levels that would normally have been declining by his trip date were instead at peak flow. The crossing that rangers had warned him about was significantly more dangerous than it would have been in an average year. The second factor was timing. Stream levels in the Sierra Nevada vary significantly throughout the day, driven by the cycle of snowmelt. Flows are typically lowest in the early morning, before daytime warming accelerates melting, and highest in the late afternoon. He reached the crossing at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, near the daily peak flow. The third factor was the water temperature. Glacial melt is cold, regardless of air temperature. The low 40s water he entered would begin causing cold shock immediately upon immersion, making controlled movement difficult and reducing the time available for self-rescue. The fourth factor was the stream bed composition. Smooth granite cobbles are standard in Sierra Nevada streams, but become extremely hazardous when combined with swift current. The rounded shapes that make them aesthetically pleasing also eliminate the edges and texture that would provide traction. The fifth factor was his decision to attempt the crossing despite the conditions. He had been warned by rangers. He had observed the water himself and noted that it looked challenging. He made the judgment that the crossing was manageable. That judgment was incorrect, but it was the kind of assessment that experienced hikers make regularly. The investigation developed several perspectives on what might have changed the outcome. The first perspective focused on timing. If he had reached the crossing in early morning, when flows were lower, the water might have been shallow enough to cross safely. His schedule had him arriving in early afternoon, the worst possible time. The second perspective focused on route alternatives. The Ray Lakes Loop can be completed in either direction. Hiking the loop clockwise, rather than counterclockwise, would have brought him to Woods Creek from the opposite direction, with the crossing much closer to the trailhead where he could have assessed conditions and turned back if necessary. The third perspective focused on turnaround criteria. Experienced wilderness travelers sometimes establish firm rules about hazard assessment. If a crossing looks dangerous, turn back regardless of schedule or investment in the trip. He had made his own assessment and decided to proceed. A more conservative threshold might have led to a different decision. The fourth perspective focused on crossing technique. While he knew the standard practices for stream crossing, there are additional techniques for high water situations, including using rope belays, crossing in groups for mutual support, or waiting for water levels to drop. As a solo hiker, some of these options were unavailable to him. The fifth perspective accepted that stream crossings during peak snowmelt involve inherent risk that cannot be fully mitigated. The combination of cold water, swift current, and slippery substrate creates conditions where a single slip can be fatal. He made a reasonable assessment that proved incorrect. The margin between success and disaster was measured in seconds and inches. He was an emergency room physician, trained to assess risk and make decisions under pressure. He had evaluated patients whose choices had led to injury or death, and he understood how quickly situations can deteriorate. His own assessment of the Woods Creek crossing, informed by years of backcountry experience, was that he could make it safely. He was wrong, and the cold mathematics of flowing water and smooth rock did not allow for correction. The Kings River drainage continues to attract thousands of backpackers each year. The Ray Lakes Loop remains one of the most popular backcountry routes in the Sierra Nevada. The Woods Creek crossing has claimed other lives before and since. In low water years, it is a routine obstacle that hikers pass without much thought. In high water years, it becomes a decision point where the margin for error disappears. Rangers continue to warn hikers about conditions. Most heed the warnings. Some do not. The crossing does not distinguish between the experienced and the novice, the careful and the reckless. It simply presents conditions, and those who enter the water discover whether their assessment was accurate. 2 cases examined. 2 sets of circumstances where nature's systems combine to produce fatal outcomes. A hiker who stepped off a trail to relieve herself and could not find her way back through dense forest. A physician who entered a swollen stream and discovered that the crossing he thought manageable was beyond his ability to complete. In both cases, the initial error was minor. People leave trails briefly every day. People cross streams during high water regularly. The errors become fatal only when combined with other factors: disorienting terrain, failed technology, cold water, slippery rock, the absence of anyone nearby to help. The patterns are consistent, even as the specific circumstances differ. The wilderness operates on timescales and through mechanisms that do not accommodate human intentions. Forests do not become less dense because a hiker needs to find her way back to a trail. Rivers do not slow because a backpacker needs to cross safely. The margin for error that seems adequate under normal conditions can vanish when variables shift. In our next section, we examine 2 more cases where the combination of factors created situations that challenged the abilities of experienced outdoors people. A mountain where altitude and weather combined to trap a climbing team in conditions they could not escape. A desert canyon where heat and distance overwhelmed a hiker who had underestimated the demands of the terrain. If you are finding value in this examination of how wilderness incidents develop, consider subscribing to this channel. Understanding how cascades form is the first step toward interrupting them. Recognizing the decision points where outcomes diverge can inform choices that keep small errors from becoming fatal. Share your observations in the comments. Have you experienced situations where multiple factors combine to create unexpected danger? Have you made decisions that worked out, but might not have under different conditions? The documentation of these patterns benefits from perspectives shared by people who have faced them. The wilderness continues to operate by its own rules. The forests continue to disorient. The rivers continue to flow. Understanding these dynamics does not eliminate risk, but it provides the foundation for decisions that account for the possibility of cascades. We return in Part 2 with additional cases from environments where nature's variables aligned against people who thought they were prepared. The examination continues. The patterns continue to emerge, and the wilderness continues to demonstrate that small errors under the wrong conditions can become irreversible. The mountains above 14,000 feet operate by different rules than the terrain below. The air contains 40% less oxygen than at sea level. Weather systems that would produce light rain in the valleys generate violent storms at altitude. Temperatures can drop 50 degrees in an hour when clouds roll in. The human body, evolved for life at lower elevations, begins to malfunction in ways that affect judgment before affecting physical capability. Colorado contains 53 peaks exceeding 14,000 feet, more than any other state in the lower 48. These mountains draw hundreds of thousands of hikers each summer, most of whom reach their summits and return safely. But the 14ers extract a toll each year, and the deaths that occur follow patterns that repeat with grim consistency. The pattern involves timing. Afternoon thunderstorms are not occasional events in the Colorado high country during summer. They are near-daily occurrences, building with such regularity that experienced mountain travelers plan their days around them. The standard guidance is to be below tree line by noon, before the storms develop. Those who violate this guidance place themselves in terrain where lightning, hypothermia, and reduced visibility can combine into lethal conditions. On July 19, 2015, a group of 4 hikers began ascending Long's Peak, the northernmost of Colorado's 14ers and one of the most technically challenging. The peak rises to 14,259 feet in Rocky Mountain National Park, its distinctive flat summit visible from the plains east of the Front Range. The standard route, known as the Keyhole, involves nearly 15 miles of round-trip hiking with approximately 5,000 feet of elevation gain. The group had driven from Denver the previous evening, arriving at the Long's Peak trailhead at approximately 1 in the morning. They planned to begin hiking at 2, reach the summit by mid-morning, and return to the trailhead by early afternoon. This schedule would keep them below the most dangerous terrain before afternoon storms developed. The group consisted of 2 couples in their early 30s. Robert Hensley and his wife Jennifer were experienced hikers who had completed several 14ers together over the previous 3 years. Their friends Michael Torres and his fiancée Amanda Chen had less mountain experience, but were physically fit and enthusiastic about attempting their first 14er. Robert had researched the route extensively. He knew about the Keyhole, a notch in the ridge that marks the transition from hiking to scrambling. He knew about the ledges, a narrow traverse across exposed rock with significant drop-offs. He knew about the Trough, a steep gully filled with loose rock that requires careful navigation. He knew about the Narrows, another exposed traverse that has claimed lives when hikers slip on wet rock. He also knew about the weather. The forecast for July 19th called for partly cloudy skies with a 40% chance of afternoon thunderstorms. This was typical summer weather for the Front Range, and Robert had hiked in similar conditions before without incident. The storms usually built afternoon and dissipated by evening. If they kept to their schedule, they would be well below the exposed terrain before any weather arrived. They departed the trailhead at 2:15 in the morning, headlamps illuminating the trail through the forest. The night was clear and cool, with temperatures in the mid-40s. Stars were visible overhead. The conditions seemed perfect. The first 3 miles of the route climb through forest and into the alpine zone above tree line. The group made good progress, reaching the boulder field at approximately 5:30 as the first light appeared on the eastern horizon. The boulder field is a vast expanse of granite blocks deposited by ancient glaciers, a lunar landscape that extends for nearly a mile below the Keyhole. They rested briefly and continued upward. The boulder field is not technically difficult, but the constant stepping from rock to rock is tiring, and progress slows as altitude begins affecting performance. Michael and Amanda, unaccustomed to the thin air, found themselves breathing heavily and needing frequent breaks. Robert began to worry about their timeline. The schedule he had planned assumed a pace that Michael and Amanda were not maintaining. By 7:30, when they should have been approaching the Keyhole, they were still in the middle of the boulder field. They were nearly an hour behind schedule. He faced a decision. They could turn back, accepting that the pace was too slow and the timeline too compromised, or they could continue, hoping to make up time on the terrain ahead. He chose to continue. This was his first error. The decision was influenced by multiple factors. They had driven hours to reach the trailhead. Michael and Amanda had been looking forward to the climb for months. The weather was still clear, with no visible clouds over the peaks. Turning back felt like giving up. They reached the keyhole at approximately 9:15, nearly 2 hours behind schedule. The keyhole itself is not dangerous, but it marks the beginning of the route's exposed sections. Beyond the keyhole, hikers traverse the ledges, climb the trough, cross the narrows, and scramble up the homestretch to the summit. In good conditions, this section takes approximately 2 hours each way. If they continued, they would be on the summit at approximately 11:30 and would not return to the keyhole until approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. This was well past the standard turnaround time for avoiding afternoon storms. Robert assessed the sky. Clouds were beginning to form over the peaks to the west, but they appeared light and scattered. The summit was visible, seemingly close despite the challenging terrain between. He made a second decision to continue. This was his second error. The 4 hikers passed through the keyhole and began traversing the ledges. This section of the route crosses a steep face with exposure to significant drops. The path is marked by painted bullseyes on the rock, but the route finding requires attention. One person in the group, Amanda, found the exposure frightening and moved slowly, requiring encouragement and occasional assistance. They reached the base of the trough at approximately 10:30. The trough is a steep gully filled with loose rock that climbers must ascend carefully to avoid dislodging stones onto those below. It is physically demanding, requiring the use of hands in many sections. By the time they reached the top of the trough, approximately 11:15, the weather had changed significantly. The scattered clouds that Robert had noted earlier had consolidated into a dark mass building over the Continental Divide to the west. The temperature had dropped noticeably. Wind had begun gusting across the exposed terrain. They were committed. The terrain between their position and the keyhole, the only safe descent route, would take at least an hour to traverse. The terrain to the summit was perhaps 30 minutes away. Going forward and going back involved similar time exposure to whatever weather was approaching. Robert chose to continue toward the summit, reasoning that they could assess conditions from the top and begin descending immediately. They crossed the narrows and began scrambling up the homestretch, the final pitch to the summit. They reached the top at approximately 11:50. The view that had drawn them up the mountain was invisible. Clouds had engulfed the summit. Visibility had dropped to perhaps 50 feet. The temperature was in the mid-30s and falling. Snow had begun mixing with the wind. What had been a summer hike had become a winter survival situation in the span of 30 minutes. They began descending immediately. The homestretch, which had been straightforward to climb, became treacherous with wet rock and reduced visibility. Jennifer slipped and fell approximately 15 feet before catching herself on a boulder. She was shaken, but not seriously injured. The fall cost them perhaps 10 minutes as the group regrouped and checked her condition. They reached the narrows and began the traverse. The painted bullseyes that marked the route were difficult to see in the swirling clouds. The rock was wet and slippery. The wind was gusting strongly enough to affect balance. Partway across the narrows, the first lightning struck. The bolt hit somewhere on the north face of the peak, perhaps a quarter mile from their position. The thunder was immediate and deafening. The smell of ozone filled the air. Above 14,000 feet, on exposed rock, in an active electrical storm, they were in one of the most dangerous positions possible. Lightning does not need to strike directly to be lethal. Ground currents from nearby strikes can travel through wet rock and electrocute anyone in contact with the surface. They had no shelter options. The Narrows offers no protected positions, no caves or overhangs where hikers can wait out storms. The only option was to continue moving toward the trough and eventually the keyhole. The next 30 minutes would determine whether they survived. Lightning continued to strike around the peak as they navigated the Narrows. Michael, who had been struggling with the terrain all day, was now visibly terrified. He froze at several points, requiring Robert to physically guide him across sections of the traverse. The group's pace slowed to a crawl. They reached the top of the trough at approximately 12:30. Descending the trough in these conditions presented its own hazards. The loose rock that was merely annoying on the way up became genuinely dangerous when wet, and when climbers above could dislodge stones onto those below. They descended in a tight group, trying to minimize the rockfall risk. Amanda was the last to begin the descent. She was perhaps 50 feet above the others when the lightning struck the ridgeline directly above the trough. The bolt did not hit her directly. It struck rock approximately 100 feet above her position. But the electrical discharge traveled through the wet granite, and she was in contact with the rock when it arrived. She collapsed immediately and began sliding down the trough, her body limp. Robert scrambled to intercept her, catching her approximately halfway down the gully. She was unconscious. She was not breathing. Robert had taken a wilderness first aid course several years earlier. He remembered the protocol for lightning strike victims, immediate CPR, because the heart often responds to resuscitation if treatment begins quickly. He positioned her on the flattest surface available and began chest compressions. Jennifer called 911. Remarkably, she had cellular signal, likely bouncing off a tower in Estes Park, visible from their position. She reported the emergency and their location. Michael stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. The storm continued around them, rain and snow mixing with the wind, lightning still striking periodically on the surrounding ridges. Robert performed CPR for approximately 15 minutes. At some point during those 15 minutes, Amanda's heart began beating again. She remained unconscious but was breathing when he stopped compressions. They could not stay where they were. The exposed position in the trough left them vulnerable to additional lightning strikes and to hypothermia as the storm continued. But moving an unconscious person down technical terrain presented enormous challenges. Robert made the decision to leave Amanda with Jennifer while he and Michael descended to the keyhole to meet the rescue team that had been dispatched. This would allow him to guide rescuers to the correct location and would give Michael, who was barely functional, something concrete to focus on. He and Michael began the traverse across the ledges. The route was now covered with a mixture of rain, snow, and hail. The painted bullseyes were nearly invisible. Navigation required memory of the ascent and careful attention to the terrain. They reached the keyhole at approximately 2:15. A park ranger had already arrived, having run the approach from the trailhead in record time. Additional rescue personnel were en route. Robert guided the ranger back across the ledges to where Jennifer was maintaining Amanda's position. Amanda had regained partial consciousness, but was confused and unable to walk. Her left arm appeared to have been burned by the electrical discharge, with characteristic branching marks visible on her skin. The rescue operation that followed involved a technical evacuation that would take nearly 8 hours. A helicopter could not approach due to the continuing storm. Rangers carried Amanda on a litter across the ledges, down the boulder field, and eventually to the trailhead, arriving well after dark. She was transported to a hospital in Denver, where she was treated for electrical burns, cardiac irregularities, and hypothermia. She survived, though she would spend several weeks in rehabilitation and would have permanent nerve damage in her left arm. The investigation examined the cascade of factors that had transformed a summer hike into a near-fatal emergency. The first factor was the group's pace. Michael and Amanda's inexperience with altitude slowed the party significantly, pushing their timeline beyond the safe window for exposed terrain. A group moving at the pace Robert had planned would have been below the keyhole before the storm arrived. The second factor was the decision points. Robert had multiple opportunities to turn back, when the pace was clearly too slow, when they reached the keyhole behind schedule, when clouds began building. At each point, he chose to continue. Any single turnaround would have prevented the emergency. The third factor was the storm's development. The 40% chance of afternoon thunderstorms had materialized into a significant system that built faster than typical patterns. The storm arrived earlier and with more intensity than the forecast suggested. The fourth factor was the terrain. Long's Peak's exposed sections offer no shelter during electrical storms. Unlike some 14ers where hikers can descend quickly to treeline, the keyhole route requires traversing technically challenging terrain that cannot be rushed regardless of weather. The fifth factor was the lightning strike itself. Electrical discharge through wet rock is unpredictable. Amanda was not in the most exposed position when the strike occurred. She simply happened to be in contact with rock that conducted the current. Inches of distance might have made the difference between her survival and her death. The investigation developed several perspectives on what might have changed the outcome. The first perspective focused on party composition. Mixing experienced hikers with novices on technical terrain creates pace problems that can cascade into timing problems. A party that moves at the slowest member's pace must account for that pace in planning. The second perspective focused on turnaround discipline. Establishing firm turnaround times and honoring them regardless of conditions or proximity to the goal is standard practice among experienced mountaineers. Robert knew the principles but did not apply them when decision points arrived. The third perspective focused on weather monitoring. While Robert had checked the forecast before the trip, he had not continued monitoring conditions during the hike. Modern satellite communicators can receive weather updates in the backcountry, providing information that might inform turnaround decisions. The fourth perspective focused on terrain selection. Long's Peak is one of the most technical standard routes among Colorado's 14ers. For a group with mixed experience levels, a less committing peak might have been more appropriate for a first 14er attempt. The fifth perspective accepted that mountain weather involves inherent unpredictability. Forecasts provide probabilities, not certainties. A 40% chance of storms means that 4 times out of 10, the storms materialize. Being above tree line when they do involves accepting risk that cannot be fully eliminated through planning. Amanda Chen survived because Robert Hensley remembered his first aid training and applied it immediately. She survived because Jennifer Hensley was able to reach emergency services despite being on a remote peak. She survived because park rangers mounted a technical rescue in dangerous conditions. She survived because the lightning did not strike her directly, because her heart responded to CPR, because the cascade of factors that had placed her in danger did not complete its work. Many hikers have not been as fortunate on Long's Peak. The mountain has claimed dozens of lives since records began, and it continues to claim lives each year. The patterns repeat. Parties that start too late, that ignore building weather, that push past reasonable turnaround times because the summit seems close. The summit is always close when viewed from below. The distance is measured not in miles, but in decisions, and each decision either adds to the margin of safety or subtracts from it. 600 miles to the southwest, in terrain that shares nothing with the alpine peaks except the capacity to kill the unprepared, the desert was demonstrating its own version of how small errors combine into fatal outcomes. Death Valley National Park encompasses over 3 million acres of the hottest, driest terrain in North America. Summer temperatures routinely exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the valley floor. The average annual rainfall is approximately 2 inches. The landscape is so harsh that early travelers named its features with terms like Funeral Mountains, Coffin Peak, and Dead Man Pass. Despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, the park draws over 1 million visitors annually. Most stay in air-conditioned vehicles, viewing the scenery from the road. Some venture into the backcountry, attempting hikes that become survival challenges when conditions exceed expectations. The Park Service strongly discourages hiking in Death Valley during summer months. Signs at trailheads warn of extreme heat danger. Rangers advise visitors that the human body cannot survive extended exposure to the temperatures that prevail from May through September. These warnings are ignored with predictable frequency. On June 23, 2019, a 29-year-old software engineer named Thomas Brennan arrived at Death Valley for what he planned as a challenging but achievable day hike. He was visiting from Seattle, where he had spent 3 years developing a reputation as an avid hiker who sought out difficult trails. He had completed numerous routes in the Cascades and Olympics, including several that involved significant elevation gain and technical terrain. He wanted to hike Golden Canyon, a moderate trail that leads through colorful Badlands formations to a viewpoint called Zabriskie Point. The round trip is approximately 6 miles, with about 1,000 feet of elevation gain. In cool weather, it is a pleasant half-day hike, suitable for fit visitors. He arrived at the Golden Canyon trailhead at approximately 7 in the morning. The temperature was already 93 degrees. The forecast called for a high of 118 degrees, with peak temperatures occurring in the early afternoon. He carried 2 liters of water, which he considered adequate for a 6-mile hike. In Seattle, 2 liters would be generous for a trail of that length. He did not understand that the desert operates by different mathematics. The human body loses water through sweat at rates that depend on temperature, humidity, and exertion level. In the Pacific Northwest, where Thomas had developed his hiking experience, sweat loss on a moderate hike might total 1 to 2 liters over several hours. In Death Valley in June, sweat loss can exceed 2 liters per hour during the hottest part of the day. He began hiking at approximately 7:15, moving at a brisk pace through the lower canyon. The trail winds through formations of ancient lake sediments, the layers of tan and yellow and red creating the scenery that draws visitors to the area. He took photographs as he walked, documenting the alien landscape for his social media accounts. By 9 in the morning, he had reached the junction where the trail splits towards Zabriskie Point. He had consumed approximately 1 liter of water. The temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. At this point, he made a decision that would prove fatal. Rather than turning back toward the trailhead, he decided to extend his hike by taking a loop route through Gower Gulch that would add approximately 2 miles to his journey, but would allow him to see additional terrain. This was his critical error. The Gower Gulch extension is not marked as more difficult than the main trail, but it traverses more exposed terrain with less shade and fewer natural rest points. The additional 2 miles, which would be insignificant in cooler conditions, represented nearly an hour of additional exposure to temperatures that were climbing toward the daily maximum. He entered Gower Gulch at approximately 9:30. The canyon is narrower than Golden Canyon, with walls that provide occasional shade, but also trap heat and block any breeze. The sand and rock underfoot absorbed solar radiation and re-emitted it upward, creating an oven effect that elevated the effective temperature beyond what the air alone would suggest. By 10:30, he had consumed his remaining water. He was approximately 3 miles from the trailhead, having completed perhaps half of the extended loop. The temperature had reached 112 degrees and was still climbing. The human body responds to extreme heat through a cascade of physiological changes. Blood vessels dilate to move heat to the skin surface. Sweat production increases to provide evaporative cooling. Heart rate accelerates to maintain blood pressure despite the dilated vessels. These responses are effective up to a point, but they require adequate hydration to function. When water intake falls below water loss, the body begins to fail in predictable stages. First, thirst becomes intense. Then, sweating decreases as the body attempts to conserve remaining fluid. Core temperature begins to rise. Cognitive function deteriorates, affecting judgment and decision-making. Eventually, organ systems begin to shut down. Thomas was experiencing the early stages of this cascade. He was intensely thirsty, but had no water. His pace had slowed dramatically. He was making decisions that a fully hydrated person would recognize as irrational. At some point around 11 in the morning, he left the established trail. The reasons for this decision cannot be determined with certainty, but the most likely explanation is heat-induced confusion. People experiencing severe dehydration often make navigational errors that would be obvious under normal conditions. He headed generally north, away from the trailhead, into terrain that became increasingly difficult. The Badlands formations in that area are deeply eroded, creating a maze of gullies and ridges that all look similar. Without clear landmarks and with impaired cognitive function, finding a way back to the trail would have been nearly impossible. His body was found 4 days later by a park ranger conducting a routine patrol. He was approximately 1.5 miles from the nearest trail, in a dry wash that offered no shade and no water. His position suggested he had collapsed while still attempting to walk. The medical examiner determined that death was caused by hyperthermia, with severe dehydration as a contributing factor. His core body temperature at the time of death could not be determined, but the condition suggested it had exceeded 106 degrees, the threshold beyond which organ damage becomes severe and often irreversible. His phone was recovered near his body. The battery had died, but forensic analysis revealed his final hours in partial detail. He had attempted to call 911 at 11:47, but the call did not connect. There is no cellular coverage in most of Death Valley. He had attempted to send a text message at 12:15. Lost, need help, very hot. The message did not transmit. His final photograph, taken at 12:32, showed the terrain around him. A featureless expanse of tan and gray, with no visible trail, no visible landmarks, no visible way out. The camera captured not just the landscape, but the desperation of a man who had realized too late that the desert would not allow him to correct his mistakes. The investigation examined the cascade of factors that had transformed a day hike into a fatal outcome. The first factor was the timing. Beginning a desert hike at 7 in the morning during June meant that the return journey would occur during the hottest part of the day. In Death Valley, the difference between morning and afternoon temperatures can be 30 degrees or more. A hike that begins at dawn and ends by mid-morning faces fundamentally different conditions than one that extends into the afternoon. The second factor was water supply. 2 liters for a 6-mile hike was grossly inadequate for Death Valley conditions. The Park Service recommends 1 gallon, approximately 4 liters, per person for every 2 hours of hiking during summer months. His supply would have been consumed in the first 90 minutes of hiking at the rate the desert demanded. The third factor was the route extension. The decision to add 2 miles by taking the Gower Gulch Loop transformed a challenging but achievable hike into one that exceeded his resources. The additional hour of exposure pushed him past the point where his water supply could sustain him. The fourth factor was the heat itself. 118 degrees is not simply uncomfortable. It is a temperature at which unprotected human exposure becomes acutely dangerous within hours. The body cannot maintain safe core temperature through sweating alone when ambient temperature approaches body temperature. The fifth factor was his experience base. His hiking background in the Pacific Northwest had not prepared him for desert conditions. The skills and intuitions he had developed in cool, wet environments did not transfer to terrain where heat and water are the primary constraints. He assessed the hike using mental models that did not apply. The sixth factor was the lack of communication options. When he realized he was in trouble, he had no way to summon help. His phone could not connect to any network. He carried no satellite messenger or emergency beacon. His distress went unheard until it was far too late. The investigation developed several perspectives on what might have changed the outcome. The first perspective focused on seasonal awareness. The Park Service explicitly warns against hiking during summer months. These warnings are posted at trailheads, printed in park literature, and communicated by rangers. He either did not see these warnings or chose to disregard them. The second perspective focused on water calculation. Understanding that desert hydration requirements are fundamentally different from temperate conditions requires either experience or research. A brief consultation of park resources would have indicated that his planned water supply was dangerously inadequate. The third perspective focused on turnaround triggers. Establishing criteria for ending a hike, such as consuming half of available water by the turnaround point, provides objective guidance that can override optimism and goal fixation. He had no such triggers and made decisions based on desire rather than resources. The fourth perspective focused on communication equipment. A satellite messenger or personal locator beacon would have allowed him to summon help when he realized he was in trouble. The cost of such devices is modest compared to the margin of safety they provide. The fifth perspective focused on the nature of desert hazards. Unlike mountain terrain where dangers are often visible, cliffs and exposure and storms, desert heat is invisible and insidious. The threat does not announce itself until the body has already begun to fail. Respecting this invisible danger requires intellectual understanding that can override sensory perception. Thomas Brennan died because he applied Pacific Northwest hiking assumptions to Mojave Desert conditions. He died because he carried water adequate for Seattle and insufficient for Death Valley. He died because he extended his hike when he should have been returning. He died because when his decisions caught up with him, there was no margin left for correction. Death Valley has claimed many lives, and it will claim more. The park remains open during summer months because some visitors take appropriate precautions, traveling during dawn hours, carrying abundant water, staying near vehicles, monitoring their physical condition constantly. Others do not take these precautions and become statistics in the annual count of heat-related fatalities. The desert does not distinguish between the prepared and the unprepared, the experienced and the novice. It simply presents conditions, and those conditions are lethal for anyone who miscalculates the margins. 4 cases examined across 2 sections. A hiker who stepped off a trail in Maine and could not find her way back. A physician who entered a swollen Sierra stream and was swept away. A hiking group that pushed past safe turnaround times on a Colorado 14er and encountered an electrical storm. A day hiker who brought Pacific Northwest assumptions to Death Valley and discovered that the desert doesn't forgive miscalculation. The patterns are consistent. Small errors, amplified by conditions, cascade into outcomes that cannot be reversed. The initial mistakes are unremarkable, the kind that outdoor enthusiasts make regularly without consequence. What transforms them into fatalities is the combination with environmental factors that eliminate the margin for recovery. In our final section, we examine 2 additional cases where the confluence of factors created situations that challenged the abilities of experienced outdoorspeople. A river guide whose expertise could not overcome the power of water in flood. A winter traveler whose preparation was insufficient for conditions that exceeded all forecasts. The wilderness continues to operate by rules that do not accommodate human intentions. Understanding those rules, respecting the margins they impose, recognizing the decision points where cascades begin, these are the tools that separate those who return from those who do not. If you are finding value in this examination of how wilderness incidents develop, consider subscribing to this channel. The patterns we document are not inevitable. The cascades we describe have interruption points. The deaths we examine were not destined, but resulted from specific decisions at specific moments. Share your observations in the comments. The documentation of these patterns benefits from perspectives shared by people who have faced them, who have made decisions that worked out, who have recognized in these accounts moments similar to their own experiences. The examination continues in Part 3. The wilderness continues to demonstrate its capacity to transform small errors into permanent consequences, and the evidence continues to accumulate that preparation, judgment, and respect for conditions are the factors that determine who survives when nature's variables align against them. Water in motion possesses force that the human mind struggles to comprehend. A cubic foot of water weighs approximately 62 pounds. A river flowing at 10 miles per hour exerts pressure comparable to wind blowing at 270 miles per hour. The mathematics of moving water do not scale linearly with depth or speed. They scale exponentially, which means that conditions that appear only slightly worse than manageable can be orders of magnitude more dangerous. River professionals understand these physics in ways that casual observers do not. They learn to read water, to identify hydraulics that trap and drown, to recognize the subtle surface patterns that indicate hazards below. They develop respect for current that borders on reverence. And occasionally, despite their expertise, they encounter conditions that exceed what skill and experience can overcome. The Lochsa River drains the Clearwater Mountains of north-central Idaho, flowing westward through one of the most remote wilderness areas in the lower 48 states. The river is famous among whitewater enthusiasts for its technical rapids, its cold temperatures, and its dramatic spring runoff when snowmelt transforms it from a challenging run into something approaching unnavigable. The Lochsa's character changes dramatically with water level. At flows below 8,000 cubic feet per second, the river presents Class 3 and 4 rapids that skilled paddlers navigate routinely. Above 12,000 cubic feet per second, the rapids merge into continuous whitewater with hydraulics powerful enough to flip rafts and trap swimmers. Above 16,000, the river becomes a flood that even the most experienced professionals avoid. On May 17, 2012, a commercial rafting company launched a trip on the Lochsa, at a flow of 11,200 cubic feet per second. This was at the upper end of the company's operating parameters, but still within the range that experienced guides considered runnable. The trip leader was a 41-year-old guide named James Sutherland, who had been running the Lochsa for 18 seasons. James was not merely experienced, he was one of the most respected river professionals in the Pacific Northwest. He had guided on rivers throughout the western United States and had worked international expeditions in Chile, Nepal, and New Zealand. He held certifications in swiftwater rescue, wilderness emergency medicine, and rope systems. He had trained other guides who went on to lead their own operations. His judgment on river conditions was trusted implicitly by his employers and peers. The trip consisted of 2 rafts carrying a total of 14 guests plus 3 guides. James commanded the lead raft with 5 guests. 2 junior guides commanded the second raft with the remaining guests. The plan was to run a 12-mile section of river that typically takes 4 to 5 hours at high water. The morning weather was overcast but dry. Air temperature was in the mid-50s. Water temperature was 47 degrees, cold enough to cause incapacitation within 15 to 20 minutes for an unprotected swimmer. All participants wore dry suits or wetsuits appropriate for the conditions. James conducted a thorough safety briefing before launch, explaining paddle commands, swimmer position, and rescue procedures. He assessed each guest's physical condition and swimming ability. He positioned stronger paddlers in key positions and placed weaker participants where they could contribute without bearing primary responsibility for navigation. The first hour of the trip proceeded without incident. The rafts navigated several significant rapids, with James demonstrating the line through each feature before the second boat followed. The guests were wet and excited, but performing well. The river was powerful, but behaving as expected for the flow level. At approximately 11 in the morning, they approached a rapid called termination, one of the most technical features on the run. At normal flows, termination presents a series of drops and waves that require precise maneuvering. At 11,000 cubic feet per second, the rapid becomes a continuous cascade of whitewater with a powerful hydraulic at the bottom, known to flip boats that enter it incorrectly. James pulled his raft to an eddy above termination and signaled for the second boat to join him. He wanted to scout the rapid, to observe the hydraulics and plan his line before committing. This was standard practice on difficult features, and his caution at this decision point was appropriate. What he observed from the scouting position concerned him. The hydraulic at the bottom of termination was larger and more recirculating than he had seen at this flow level in previous years. The river right line that he typically used appeared compromised by a wave train that was pushing boats toward the center of the hydraulic, rather than around it. He considered portaging, carrying the rafts around the rapid on shore. But the banks at termination are steep and heavily forested, making portage extremely difficult and time-consuming. He considered lining the boats, using ropes to lower them through the rapid from shore. But the configuration of the rapid made this impractical. He decided to run the rapid using an alternative line on river left, a route he had used occasionally in past years when right-side conditions were unfavorable. This line required threading between 2 large rocks and catching a narrow eddy partway through the rapid to set up for the final drop. This decision was reasonable given the information available. The river left line was less common, but not unprecedented. James had run it successfully in previous seasons. He briefed his crew on the paddle commands they would need and pushed off into the current. The first half of the rapid went as planned. The raft threaded between the rocks, and James called for the crew to paddle hard, left to catch the mid-rapid eddy. The raft responded, swinging toward the intended refuge. Then the river showed him something he had not anticipated. The mid-rapid eddy, which in previous years had provided a stable staging area, had been altered by the high water. The hydraulics that defined its boundary had shifted, creating a pour-over that did not appear at lower flows. The raft, instead of catching the eddy, was pulled over the pour-over and into a hole that James had not known existed. A hole, in river terminology, is a hydraulic feature where water flowing over an obstacle recirculates back upstream, creating a trap that can hold boats and swimmers indefinitely. The hole that caught his raft was approximately 15 feet wide and recirculating with force that exceeded anything he had experienced in 18 seasons on this river. The raft flipped immediately. All 6 occupants were thrown into the water. James surfaced in the recirculating current, being pulled back upstream toward the center of the hole. He knew immediately that he was in a life-threatening situation. He also knew the technique for escaping holes: swim down and out, using the current at the bottom of the water column to escape the surface recirculation. He executed the technique, diving deep and swimming hard downstream. The current released him, and he surfaced approximately 30 feet below the hole in the calmer water at the bottom of the rapid. He looked back to assess the situation. The raft was still in the hole, flipped upside down, recirculating in the hydraulic. 3 of his guests had been flushed out and were swimming toward the second raft, which had stopped above the rapid when they saw the flip. 2 guests were not visible. He swam to shore and ran upstream along the bank, scanning the water for the missing swimmers. He found the first approximately 50 yards downstream from the hole, clinging to a rock in the middle of the river. The man was conscious but clearly in shock, his face pale and his movements sluggish. James entered the water and swam to the rock, towing a throw rope that he had grabbed from the shore. He reached the man and clipped him to the rope, then signaled to the guides on shore to haul him in. The man was pulled to safety and immediately wrapped in thermal blankets. 1 guest was still missing. James searched for 20 minutes, swimming the eddy lines and scanning every hydraulic where a person might be trapped. The other guides joined the search, covering the river downstream of the rapid. They found the overturned raft, which had eventually flushed from the hole and was pinned against a rock 200 yards downstream. They found a paddle, a water bottle, and a shoe. They did not find the missing guest. Her name was Rebecca Thornton, a 34-year-old veterinarian from Spokane who had booked the trip as a birthday present to herself. She had told the guides at the put-in that she was excited but nervous, that this was her first whitewater experience, that she trusted them to keep her safe. Her body was recovered 3 days later, found by kayakers approximately 4 miles downstream from termination. She was still wearing her life jacket and helmet. The medical examiner determined that she had drowned, likely within the first few minutes after the flip. The cold water would have caused gasping and inhalation of water. The power of the hydraulic would have prevented self-rescue, even if she had retained consciousness. The investigation examined the cascade of factors that had led to her death. The first factor was the water level. 11,200 cubic feet per second was within the company's operating parameters, but represented conditions significantly more dangerous than moderate flows. The margins for error that existed at 8,000 CFS had narrowed substantially at the higher level. The second factor was the altered hydraulics. The mid-rapid eddy that James had relied upon in his alternative line had been transformed by the high water into a hazard rather than a refuge. This change was not predictable from shore observation, and James had no way to know that the feature he was counting on no longer existed in its previous form. The third factor was the hole itself. The hydraulic that flipped the raft and trapped Rebecca was not visible from the scouting position. It existed only at this particular flow level, created by the interaction of water volume and subsurface rock formations that were benign at lower flows. The fourth factor was the cold water. At 47 degrees, the Lochsa allows very limited survival time for swimmers. The cold shock response, which causes involuntary gasping when the body is suddenly immersed, can cause drowning within seconds if the gasp occurs underwater. Rebecca likely experienced this response when she was thrown from the raft. The fifth factor was the power disparity between human capability and river force. Once she was in the hole, Rebecca had no ability to escape through her own efforts. The recirculating hydraulic was simply stronger than any human swimmer. Her survival depended on either being flushed out randomly or being rescued by others, and neither occurred quickly enough. The investigation developed several perspectives on what might have changed the outcome. The first perspective focused on flow thresholds. The company's operating parameters allowed trips at flows up to 12,000 CFS, but some river professionals argue that commercial operations with inexperienced guests should maintain more conservative limits. Reducing the maximum to 9 or 10,000 CFS would have prevented the trip from launching that day. The second perspective focused on the scouting decision. James had observed that conditions were worse than expected, but chose to run an alternative line rather than abort. A more conservative decision would have been to portage despite the difficulty, or to hike the guests out and return for the equipment later. The third perspective focused on the unpredictability of high water hydraulics. Features that are safe at one level become lethal at another, and these changes are not always visible from above. Running rivers at elevated flows necessarily involves accepting uncertainty that cannot be eliminated through experience or observation. The fourth perspective focused on guest screening. Rebecca had no whitewater experience. Placing a complete novice on an expert-level run at high water, regardless of guide qualifications, involves accepting risk that the guest cannot fully evaluate. Some argue that certain conditions should be reserved for participants with demonstrated skills. The fifth perspective focused on the inherent danger of the activity. Whitewater rafting involves accepting that equipment failures, unexpected hydraulics, and swimmer entrapments can occur despite all precautions. Rebecca had signed a waiver acknowledging these risks. Whether the acknowledgement constituted informed consent, given her lack of experience with which to evaluate the dangers, remains debated. James Sutherland continued guiding after the accident, though he has not returned to the Lochsa. He testified at the inquest that he had made the best decisions he could with the information available, that he had followed protocols, that he could not have predicted the altered hydraulic that flipped his raft. The jury found no criminal negligence. He has spoken publicly about the incident in professional contexts, emphasizing the lessons he believes other guides should take from it. He talks about the humility that high water demands, about the danger of relying on past experience when conditions have changed, about the inadequacy of human strength against the force of moving water. The Lochsa continues to flow each spring, its volume rising and falling with snowmelt from the Clearwater Mountains. Commercial operations continue to run the river, though most companies now maintain lower flow thresholds than they did in 2012. Termination Rapid continues to challenge paddlers, its hydraulics shifting each season as the river rearranges the boulders on its bed. Rebecca Thornton's name does not appear on any memorial at the river. Her death was ruled an accident, the result of factors that combined in ways that could not have been fully anticipated. Her family received a settlement from the rafting company's insurance. Her memory persists among those who knew her and among the river community that discusses her case when the topic of high water risk arises. The river does not remember her. It flows as it has always flowed, indifferent to the lives it has taken and will take, operating by physics that do not accommodate human intentions or human grief. 300 miles to the east, in a mountain range where winter persists 8 months of the year, another cascade was demonstrating how conditions can exceed preparation, even when preparation is extensive. The Wind River Range of western Wyoming contains some of the most remote wilderness in the continental United States. The peaks rise above 13,000 feet, glaciated summits that see few visitors even in summer. In winter, the range becomes genuinely Arctic, with temperatures dropping below -40 degrees and winds exceeding 100 miles per hour during storms. Very few people venture into the wind rivers during winter. Those who do are typically experienced mountaineers seeking challenges that cannot be found in more accessible ranges. They understand that the margin for error in winter wilderness approaches zero, that equipment failure or injury far from help can be fatal within hours, that the weather can change from survivable to lethal faster than a person can retreat to safety. On February 8, 2020, a 37-year-old mountaineer named Erik Lindqvist began a solo winter traverse of a section of the Wind River Range. He planned to travel approximately 40 miles over 5 days, crossing 2 high passes and camping in snow shelters he would construct each evening. It was an ambitious objective, but Erik had the credentials to attempt it. He was a professional mountain guide based in Jackson, Wyoming, with 15 years of experience leading expeditions in Alaska, Patagonia, and the Himalaya. He had completed winter ascents of Denali and several 8,000-meter peaks. He held certifications from the American Mountain Guides Association at the highest level. He taught avalanche safety courses and had written articles for mountaineering publications about cold weather survival techniques. His equipment was appropriate for the conditions. He carried a -40-degree sleeping bag, a 4-season bivvy shelter, multiple redundant navigation systems, emergency communication devices, and food calculated to provide 5,000 calories per day. He wore layered clothing systems designed for extreme cold and carried backup items for critical components that might fail. He filed a detailed trip plan with the Shoshone National Forest Ranger Station, specifying his route, his timeline, and his check-in protocols. He carried a satellite messenger programmed to send position reports every 4 hours and to transmit emergency signals if activated. He had done everything that a responsible winter traveler should do. The weather forecast for his trip window showed cold but stable conditions. Temperatures were expected to range from -10 to -25 degrees Fahrenheit, typical for February in the Wind Rivers. Winds were forecast at 15 to 25 miles per hour, manageable for an experienced mountaineer. No significant precipitation was expected for the first 3 days of his trip. He departed from the Elkhart Park trailhead on the morning of February 8th, skiing into the wilderness on a route he had traveled in summer, but never in winter. The snow conditions were good, allowing efficient travel. He made 12 miles on the first day and established his first camp in a snow shelter he excavated in approximately 2 hours. His satellite messenger transmitted his position at 8 in the evening, showing him on schedule at his planned first camp. He sent a preset message to his wife in Jackson. Day 1 complete. All good. Cold, but beautiful. The second day proceeded similarly. He crossed the first of his 2 planned passes, a saddle at 11,800 feet that required climbing approximately 2,000 feet from his camp. The ascent took longer than anticipated due to wind-loaded snow on the approach, but he reached the pass by early afternoon and descended to his second camp by late afternoon. His satellite messenger transmitted at 8 in the evening, showing him slightly behind schedule but within acceptable margins. His message read, "Day 2 done. Pass was tough. Tomorrow easier, I think." What neither Erik nor the forecasters knew was that a weather system was developing over the Gulf of Alaska that would arrive in the Wind Rivers approximately 36 hours ahead of predictions. The system was not unprecedented, but its speed and intensity exceeded what the models had indicated. By the time updated forecasts were issued, Erik was beyond the reach of any communication that might have warned him. The morning of February 10th, his third day, began clear, but with a quality of light that experienced mountain travelers recognize as precursor to weather change. The sky had a milky cast. The barometric pressure, which Erik monitored with an altimeter watch, had dropped noticeably overnight. He faced a decision. His route for the day included crossing his second pass, a higher saddle at 12,400 feet, that would be significantly more exposed than the first. The distance was approximately 8 miles, with the pass roughly at the midpoint. If weather was coming, he would be most vulnerable during the pass crossing. He could hunker down and wait, hoping the weather would pass or prove less severe than the signs suggested. But his food supply was calculated for 5 days, and extending the trip would require rationing that would compromise his energy reserves. He could also attempt to retreat, but he was now closer to his planned exit than to his entry point. He decided to push forward, planning to move fast and get over the pass before conditions deteriorated significantly. This decision was consistent with how experienced mountaineers often operate, moving through danger quickly rather than remaining in it longer. He broke camp at first light and began skiing toward the pass. For the first 2 hours, conditions remained acceptable. Cold, windy, but navigable. He reached the base of the pass climb at approximately 9 in the morning. The weather arrived as he was ascending the pass. It came not gradually, but suddenly, the way mountain storms often do. One moment the sky was overcast but bright. The next, visibility had dropped to 50 feet, and snow was blowing horizontally across the slope. The temperature, already well below zero, began dropping as the storm's cold core arrived. He was approximately 500 feet below the pass when conditions became genuinely severe. Visibility dropped to near zero. The wind increased to speeds that investigators later estimated at 60 to 70 miles per hour. The wind chill pushed effective temperature below -60 degrees. At -60, wind chill, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Breathing becomes painful as cold air sears the lungs. Goggles fog and then freeze, eliminating vision. The body loses heat faster than metabolic processes can generate it, even with maximum exertion. Erik stopped climbing and began constructing an emergency shelter. This was the correct response to the conditions. Movement in a whiteout risks disorientation and falling. The priority becomes protection from the elements until conditions improve. He excavated a snow trench using his avalanche shovel, working as quickly as the conditions allowed. The snow was wind-packed and difficult to cut. His hands, despite heavy gloves, were losing dexterity. The process that should have taken 30 minutes took over an hour. He crawled into the trench and pulled his bivvy shelter over the opening. Inside, out of the direct wind, conditions were survivable. His sleeping bag could maintain his core temperature even in extreme cold. He had food and a stove to melt snow for water. He could wait out the storm. He activated his satellite messenger's emergency beacon at approximately 11 in the morning. The device transmitted his coordinates and an alert to search and rescue services. Under normal circumstances, a helicopter could reach his position within a few hours. These were not normal circumstances. The storm that had caught him was affecting the entire region. Winds at the surface were gusting over 80 miles per hour. No helicopter could fly. No ground team could travel. The rescue that his beacon requested was physically impossible until conditions improved. He waited in his snow trench as the storm raged above him. His satellite messenger continued transmitting position reports, showing him stationary at approximately 11,900 feet elevation, 500 feet below the pass he had been trying to cross. The storm continued through February 10th and into February 11th. Winds remained above 50 miles per hour. Visibility remained near zero. Temperatures remained in the -30 to -40 degree range, with wind chills exceeding -70. His satellite messenger transmitted through February 10th, showing his position unchanged. On the morning of February 11th, the transmission stopped. When the storm broke on February 12th, search and rescue teams launched immediately. A helicopter reached his position within 2 hours of conditions becoming flyable. They found his snow trench, his bivvy shelter, his equipment. They found Erik Lindqvist deceased inside his sleeping bag. The medical examiner determined that death was caused by hypothermia, with carbon monoxide poisoning as a contributing factor. The carbon monoxide finding was significant. It indicated that he had used his stove inside the enclosed shelter, likely to generate heat or melt water, and that the combustion had consumed oxygen and produced toxic gas in the poorly ventilated space. Using a stove inside a snow shelter is dangerous precisely because of this risk. Erik knew this. He had taught courses that included warnings about exactly this scenario. But at some point during the storm, facing conditions that were killing him through heat loss, he had made the decision to fire the stove anyway. The investigation examined the cascade of factors that had led to his death. The first factor was the weather forecast failure. The storm arrived 36 hours earlier than predictions indicated and proved more intense than models suggested. Erik made his decisions based on information that turned out to be incorrect through no fault of his own. The second factor was his position when the storm hit. If he had been lower in elevation, in more sheltered terrain, the same storm would have been survivable. His location on an exposed slope during the pass approach maximized his vulnerability to the conditions. The third factor was the timing of his departure. If he had waited at his second camp, observing the weather signs that suggested incoming change, he might have avoided being caught in the open. His decision to push forward was understandable, but proved fatal. The fourth factor was the storm's duration. A storm lasting 12 hours might have been survivable in his shelter. The storm lasted over 30 hours, exceeding the duration his preparations could accommodate. The fifth factor was the rescue impossibility. His emergency beacon functioned correctly and transmitted his distress, but no rescue was possible until the storm passed. The technology that was supposed to provide a safety margin could not overcome the physical reality of conditions that grounded all aircraft. The sixth factor was the stove decision. Facing progressive hypothermia in his shelter, he chose to generate heat through combustion, despite knowing the risks. Whether this decision reflected impaired judgment from cold exposure or a calculated gamble that carbon monoxide was preferable to freezing cannot be determined. The investigation developed several perspectives on what might have changed the outcome. The first perspective focused on weather interpretation. The signs that something was changing, the milky sky, the pressure drop, were present on the morning of his third day. A more conservative interpretation might have led him to shelter in place rather than attempt the pass. The second perspective focused on trip timing. February is statistically the coldest month in the Wind Rivers, with the highest frequency of severe storms. Scheduling the traverse for March or April would have reduced the probability of encountering conditions like those that killed him. The third perspective focused on route selection. The pass he was crossing when the storm hit was the most exposed point on his planned route. Alternative routes with lower passes or more sheltered approaches might have provided better options when weather deteriorated. The fourth perspective focused on the limitations of technology. Satellite messengers provide communication and location services, but they cannot summon help that is physically impossible to deliver. The beacon created an expectation of rescue that conditions could not fulfill. The fifth perspective focused on the inherent risk of solo winter mountaineering. With a partner, Erik might have been able to construct a more robust shelter, might have had someone to monitor his condition and prevent the stove decision, might have survived through shared body heat and mutual support. Solo travel eliminates these redundancies. The sixth perspective accepted that some conditions simply exceed human capability to survive. A storm of that intensity, arriving unexpectedly, catching a climber in exposed terrain, represents a scenario where survival depends on luck rather than skill. Erik had 15 years of experience, the best equipment available, and comprehensive preparation. It was not enough. His death affected the mountain guiding community significantly. Colleagues who had trusted his judgment questioned whether anyone's judgment was sufficient for the conditions that can develop in winter wilderness. Training programs he had helped develop were revised to emphasize even more conservative decision-making. The articles he had written about cold weather survival were republished with editors' notes about his death. The Wind River Range continues to draw winter travelers, though fewer than before his death became widely known. Those who go do so with awareness that the range has killed people more experienced and better prepared than themselves. They carry the same equipment, follow the same protocols, make the same calculations about acceptable risk, and they understand that the calculations can prove wrong in ways that are not survivable. 6 cases examined across 3 sections: a hiker lost in Maine forest, a physician swept away in a Sierra stream, a hiking group caught by lightning on a Colorado peak, a day hiker overwhelmed by Death Valley heat, a rafter drowned in an Idaho hydraulic, a mountaineer frozen in a Wyoming storm. The victims ranged in age from 29 to 66. Their experience ranged from novice to elite professional. They died in forests, rivers, mountains, and deserts in conditions ranging from summer heat to winter cold. What they shared was not demographic profile or skill level. What they shared was the moment when the cascade completed, when the combination of factors exceeded their capacity to survive. Each case began with something small: a bathroom break-off trail, a stream crossing attempted at the wrong time, a turnaround time ignored, a water supply underestimated, a rapid run at high flow, a pass approached in deteriorating weather. These small beginnings are not remarkable. Hikers leave trails daily. Streams are crossed constantly. Turnaround times are adjusted routinely. Water calculations are made on every trip. Rapids are run at elevated flows throughout the whitewater season. Passes are crossed in imperfect weather by mountaineers around the world. What transformed these ordinary decisions into fatal outcomes was the combination with other factors: disorienting terrain that prevented return to the trail, cold water that eliminated swimming ability within minutes, electrical storms that arrived faster than forecast, heat that exceeded the body's capacity to regulate temperature, hydraulics that were invisible from above and inescapable from below, storms that grounded all rescue aircraft. The wilderness does not require extraordinary circumstances to kill. It requires only the alignment of ordinary factors in ways that eliminate the margin for error. The alignment is not predictable. It cannot be prevented through preparation alone. It can only be made less likely through conservative decisions that maintain margins even when conditions seem acceptable. The people who died in these cases were not reckless. They were not ignorant of the risks they faced. They made assessments that proved incorrect, decisions that worked out for others on other days, but did not work out for them. The difference between their outcomes and the outcomes of countless similar trips that ended safely was not skill or preparation. It was the specific combination of factors they encountered. This is the nature of wilderness risk. It is probabilistic rather than deterministic. Conservative decisions reduce the probability of fatal outcomes, but do not eliminate it. Aggressive decisions increase the probability, but do not guarantee it. The wilderness operates by rules that do not distinguish between the careful and the careless, the experienced and the novice. It simply presents conditions, and those conditions either fall within human survivability or they do not. Understanding this does not require abandoning wilderness travel. It requires approaching wilderness with appropriate humility, with recognition that the margin for error varies with conditions, with willingness to turn back when factors begin accumulating unfavorably. The decision points in these cases were identifiable in retrospect. Geraldine Largay could have carried a compass and learned to use it. David Kowalski could have crossed the stream earlier in the day or not at all. Robert Hensley could have turned his group around at any of several points before the storm arrived. Thomas Brennan could have carried more water or shortened his route. James Sutherland could have portaged termination or chosen not to launch at that flow level. Erik Lindqvist could have waited out the weather signs at his second camp. These alternative decisions seem obvious from the safety of retrospect. They were not obvious in the moment, when the factors that would combine into fatality had not yet aligned, when the cascade had not yet begun. The people who made these decisions were doing what outdoor enthusiasts do constantly, making judgments about acceptable risk based on available information. Their judgments were wrong. The information was incomplete. The conditions proved more severe than anticipated. The margins they thought they had did not exist. If there is a lesson in these cases, it is not that wilderness travel is too dangerous to attempt. It is that wilderness travel demands respect for uncertainty, for the possibility that conditions will exceed expectations, for the reality that small errors can cascade into unsurvivable situations. The forests and rivers and mountains and deserts will continue to draw people who seek experiences that cannot be found elsewhere. Most will return safely, their judgments validated by outcomes, their margins never tested. Some will not return, their judgments invalidated by combinations of factors they could not have fully anticipated. The difference between these groups is not always skill or preparation or wisdom. Sometimes it is simply which factors aligned on which day, whether the storm arrived early or late, whether the hydraulic was running or not, whether the temperature was survivable or not. The wilderness does not owe anyone safe passage. It operates by its own rules, indifferent to human intentions and human hopes. Understanding those rules, respecting the margins they impose, recognizing the cascade potential in every decision, these are the foundations of wilderness travel that acknowledges what the wilderness actually is. If you found value in this examination of how nature's factors combine into fatal outcomes, consider subscribing to this channel. We document patterns that can inform decisions. We analyze cascades that might be interrupted by different choices at different moments. We present evidence that the wilderness is not malevolent, but is also not forgiving. Share your observations in the comments. Have you recognized decision points in your own travels where outcomes might have been different? Have you encountered conditions that exceeded your preparation and survived through luck or skill? The documentation of these patterns benefits from perspectives shared by people who have faced them. The wilderness continues to operate by rules that do not accommodate human schedules or human optimism. The weather continues to change. The rivers continue to flow. The mountains continue to generate storms that arrive faster than forecasts predict. Understanding these realities does not eliminate risk, but it provides the foundation for decisions that account for what the wilderness actually is, rather than what we wish it to be. Be humble in wild places. Maintain margins even when conditions seem good. Recognize that the cascade can begin with any decision, and once it begins, it may not be possible to stop. The mountains and rivers and forests will be there tomorrow, and next year, and for generations to come. They will continue to offer experiences that transform and challenge and inspire. They will also continue to kill those who encounter the wrong combination of factors at the wrong moment. The choice to enter the wilderness is a choice to accept this reality. Make that choice with eyes open, with preparation thorough, with humility intact. And when the factors begin aligning unfavorably, when the signs suggest that conditions are deteriorating, when the voice in your head whispers that something is not right, listen. The wilderness rewards those who pay attention. It punishes those who do not. And sometimes, despite everything, it takes people who did everything right. That is the nature of wild places. That is the truth that these cases reveal. That is the reality that anyone who ventures into wilderness must understand and accept. The examination is complete. The patterns have been documented. The evidence has been presented. What you do with this information is your choice. The wilderness will be waiting, operating by its own rules, indifferent to what you have learned. Go carefully, go humbly, and return safely.